Ismail Abdulsalam beatsboxingmayhem.com. I'm here with a very special guest. I've been on his show a few times. Now he's on my platform to celebrate a monumental achievement. He has published his first book called Inside the Ropes of Boxing, A Boxer's Guide to the Sport. I am with none other than Lukey Boxing, also known as Lucas Ketelle. Lukey, appreciate you making time and congratulations. How does it feel being the first time published author?
Well, it feels better being your friend first and foremost. Being an author doesn't really change anything. I still go to the store, I still have to pay bills, but it feels cool to have that book right there. And the big thing with me is I want to help young fighters, and I want anyone that pays for my book or like you giving me the opportunity to be on your platform. I want people to feel they either used their time wisely or spent their money well. I didn't want anyone feeling ripped off. So that's my biggest goal. If I accomplish that, I'll feel really good.
Awesome. Great to hear that. And a lot of times with the boxing industry, most people are looking for what they can get out of it, whether it's media, whether it's promoters and managers. That's the one thing that really stood out to me with this, that you're actually giving back to the boxing community. When did you actually start this journey of, I want to write this book? When did that first pop into your mind?
Well, I think the funniest thing is but I always try to bring you on my show because you're a great boxing personality and you have great insights. And I think that you do a very good job of mixing like poetic language with insights on the boxing. And that's why I enjoy reading and following your work because it's not just literal writing. It's kind of like art with sport. And that's what I'm drawn to. But to answer this question is I assumed you'd be the author and you'd be on my show in December or January, and we're talking about this true crime book that you did. And I was talking with one of my good buddies, Frank Staya, who's a friend of mine. And you know how friends always talk. They get on the phone, they talk. And he just kind of threw it at me. He said, before your days are done, you should probably write two books. And then I said, well, shoot, we don't know like how many years of these I got. I think I got a lot of years, but maybe I don't. So then I sat down and I started to write a book. And what started to come out was just things I wish I had known in boxing. And it turned out to be a 200-page book. And then I got an editor and it turned into 117 pages because they just said a lot of those points you made, it's just the same words. Are we writing to make the best version of this book? Or are we writing for you to feel good that you hit 200 pages? So that was very humbling. But the answer to this question was Frank Staya challenged me to write two books on boxing. And I'd like to believe I finished the first one. So now I just have to write one more and the challenge is finished.
Absolutely. And you mentioned humbling. That goes through a lot of people's minds when they get to that editing process and the editor kind of rips it up as far as what's essential, what's not. One thing people struggle with is finding their narrative voice. But I feel like you didn't have that issue, or did you when you were writing this book? Because everything flows very naturally, chapter to chapter.
I feel like if anyone that knows me, I'm pretty comfortable with who I am. So it's like I literally just tried to write the book the way I talk. I'm not someone that like, oh, should I be this? I mean, you're getting lukey. I'm trying to write. All I try to do is write the book because here's another reason, and I want to share this exclusively with. Well, that sounds like such a prick statement. I'm sharing it exclusively with your platform. Like there's all these massive, but I am humbled to be on here, and I want to tell you things that I don't tell other people based off of how much I respect you. And one reason I wrote this book is my passion is a lot of amateur boxing. My passion is a lot of going to the gyms. And to a 15-year-old, I'm a pretty cool dude. To the world, I might be whatever, just a face on it, Twitter. But to a 15-year-old, I'm someone that it's like, wow, this guy's here. Maybe I should work harder. I'm like a dream enabler. And you get a lot of conversations with parents where you kind of have the same hour conversation over and over and over again. So this book also is, hey, can you get this book? It's a good starting place to look at some of the things I think are true if you're starting out in boxing, if you're going pro in boxing, even if you just have a passion for boxing. Can you look this over and then maybe call me up and then we can talk from there? It's also selfishly a way for me to allocate my time a little better because I've kind of been having this conversation for 2.5 years with people.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that really stuck with me early on in the book that I really hope people take to heart, you said something about everyone that you talk to in boxing, really the majority of people that you talk to are not your friends. Even someone you talk to regularly, always keep that in mind that this is a business that you're in and conduct yourself like a professional. I feel like a lot of us had to learn that the hard way, so to speak. Can you just give a little bit of insight the first time you actually learned that when you got into the boxing industry? Because I feel like that's kind of like the loss of innocence for all of us, realizing that.
Well, first off, I appreciate you reading the book. That's like really cool because I'm gonna read your book, but it's like this is the first interview I've done where someone's read the book. So this is
Mm.
really cool that we're going through the book because normally it's like, hey, generic kind of thing. So I like that we're getting specific. Machiavelli's The Prince is my favorite book ever. I read that first when I was like 15 or 16 years old, and I read that once a week. So, like, obviously, a lot of my thinking is always going to be skewed towards Machiavelli or Lyndon B. Johnson because I read the Caro series on Lyndon B. Johnson a lot. So,
Okay.
I'm going to be a little bit of a darker dude in terms of the way I think because those are kind of like what I look at as ways to navigate the world. There's been a lot of times, but let me give you an example of one where it's not even really a great example, but it was a major turning point was there were I won't say the names, which is probably the most useless thing on content creation because you're like all these names are famous, right? So it's like I
Right.
won't say the names that will get the fans excited about who they are, but it's not rocket science. If you've seen who I am and you've seen the people I came up with, you can kind of piece this together. What happened was um we had a whole group in a gym, a group of 10 fighters, and it felt like a movement. And I was talking to my grandpa when he's still alive, and it's like, we're coming. It's everything's going to happen. We got this whole unit. It's unstoppable. There's like 8 fighters, and we're going to be with this promotional company. And then for whatever reason, it's things start to move in different directions. And even though you're friends with people, it's almost like a gang was the way it turned into. It was like you can't be neutral. So it was like I was trying to be cool with everybody, but what ended up happening was I was the guy that everyone was looking at. Oh, well, you hang out with that guy, or you hang out with this guy. And it took years and years of me growing and having to be more secure as a person that I am to develop from that. So that's like a direct experience. But what I think is whether it's promoters or managers, they're always trying to befriend you, but you always have to remember they're not necessarily your friend, they're a working colleague. So you don't always have to be friends with them. I firmly believe that you have to command yourself to have respect and you have to be respectful of others. That's how I was raised. But you don't need like I'm very cautious of anyone that calls me family if I don't know you or if I've worked with you 2 times. Like, wait,
Right.
we're family? Like, I don't know. Do you know what my family's like? So I think the big thing in boxing is we have a lot of people that were never a part of a family, or there's families that weren't maybe as dynamic as many people would have liked. And the concept of friends or unconditional love or the concept of getting praise that can be actually dangerous for a young person that hearing that for the first time, it blows up their ego to be aware and view this as a business.
Absolutely, absolutely. And getting to the next point, sparring. I'm glad that you devoted a whole chapter to that because I feel like a lot of professional fighters never really have even learned the purpose of that, which is, as you mentioned, to learn and better yourself. And you really go into it as far as don't get caught up trying to prove how tough you are and all that because your body is essentially your marketing tool and what's going to keep you going. You need to preserve that for as long as possible. I want you just to touch on a little bit, being that you've had so much time in the gym, how many fighters have you seen actually deplete and lose themselves by having too much pride when it comes to sparring and not utilizing it for what its purpose really is, and that's to learn and grow as a fighter?
At least 6 or 7. And it's like that's only in the last 10 years. And I think the big issue, right? If you're fighting a 3 round fight as an amateur, why are you sparring 12 rounds?
Mm,
Right?
right.
If you're in a 6 round fight, why are you sparring 10 rounds? Shouldn't the goal always be what you're working towards and being the best version? But the problem is a lot of these fighters say, well, Manny Pacquiao fights 12 round fights. So then my dad's probably the coach. So now I want to show the world I can do it. It's a lot of trial and error. I think the big thing in the sparring chapter that I wanted to share and I'm glad I got to share in it, was you need different levels of sparring. You need to see what a Shakur Stevenson is like and to see how that highest level of the sport is. You also need someone that's exactly at where you're at. And then you kind of also need that confidence sparring of someone that you can do everything you can on, and you need all three of those at different points of the camp. And there's no formula, right? Some people say, oh, you need the confidence sparring at the end, you need it in the middle and the beginning. There's no formula, but I truly believe elite fighters kind of get all of that, and as they get better, they kind of move away from having that top sparring because they really know how to preserve themselves for the fight. But when you're growing, you need that challenge, at least I believe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And dealing with that whole point about as a boxer, you're the main person, but you're not able to do everything on your own. You really kind of lay out the importance of the team that you have around you, from the manager to the promoter, even the cut man. And then, of course, extending from that, if you're able to get a publicist, all that works to building you as the brand. And in order to do that, you have to have, as you said, difficult conversations, not just with yourself, but with your team and what your goals are. So regarding that, I wanted you to kind of touch on a little bit more. What is the biggest question you think a fighter can ask themselves before they decide to get into boxing as a business?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is like no boxer thinks of a mission statement, right? So they're like, their mission statement is, I'm going to be world champion. I'm going to be Floyd Mayweather. Not necessarily helpful because there's only four world champions, often two to three, and there's only one Floyd Mayweather, and there's only a few others that are compared to him. So most people are saying, like, I need to be an industry leader and an icon, or else my career is a failure. I think the biggest thing, if you look at boxing, is how I always use this word in life and in business is scale. How can you scale your career? How can you create milestones on a business statement? Can I win a national title? Would a promoter take interest in me? How much is a promoter going to invest in my career? Realistically, how much can I invest in myself? Can I own my own photos? Can I own my own videos? How much do I want to treat this like a business? And I think if you answer that and basically say, I don't want to do that, it's a good reason to not go pro, right? Because those uncertainties mean that probably those uncertainties are going to come out in the ring. And I think talking through boxing as a business and understanding how much you're willing to put in and how much you're able to do, this is another thing. You can put a lot in, but you also have to not endanger your financial freedom. So don't risk your situation, don't risk your livelihood just because you want to go all in on this dream. Make sure you're okay first and then put your financial capital in it. But I think that's a good way to understand how much you believe in yourself. Money always helps you understand how much you believe in a dream.
Absolutely. It's very important to celebrate those wins, even if they're small. Like you said, building towards something, and you lay that out very well. As far as examples, too, that's another thing that I really like that you did. You name names, people that have done things that you might be, as far as a boxer looking at this, models to look forward to, even if you're like a publicist. You mentioned Mario Serrano, who's been in the game for a long time. So you give examples of people that have been successful and how they've done it. One thing that interests me is you mentioned Xander Zayas as kind of a model of integrity and how to carry yourself. I thought that was really cool because, of course, we're expecting people to be reading this book 5, 10, 15 years in the future. So you always have to be careful of, well, who am I mentioning? Because you don't know how they're going to turn out, especially somebody young like that. What did you see in Xander that let you know he's on the right path, even though he's still very young in his career, that you felt comfortable, citing him in the book as a good example of a young fighter coming up?
Because whenever I'm around him and he's so young, he's how I wished I was mature when I was his age.
Mhm.
It's like he's like you see the influence of his father, JC his coach, and Peter Kahn, and you just see how much that he's been he's been brought up so much on being a good character individual and raised around the business of it. At a young age, he's already a veteran. So, I mean, I think that when you look at a young fighter, he's the golden standard of what any young fighter could be or should be to me. Because what young fighter out there behaves more like a professional than Xander Zayas at this point, right?
Very good point. Very good point. I don't want to say one of my favorite chapters is also the big fight. Because when we think about big fights, we automatically think what? Pay-per-view, like you mentioned Floyd Mayweather. But when you're starting out, you shouldn't be thinking about that. Your big fight is maybe your first big test, your first big local show. So you really kind of conceptualize the importance of the steps you need to take. And there's a big fight at each step. The big fight might be who you're selecting as your manager. All those things are important to building the brand that you hope to become. So in touching on that, as far as the big fight, when did you realize in your career that there's a difference between a big boxing match and a big boxing event? Because they're not always the same. And you mentioned something very good about differentiating something that may be like a Rolling Stone or a concert event as opposed to a legacy fight. They're not always the same. When did you realize that in your career?
When Andy Vences fought Eric De Leon. So
Mhm.
like well actually no, when Andy Vences fought Casey Ramos, because it was like, okay, Andy's building up on Top Rank. And it's like there's these thresholds I see. So when you get to 15-0, it's kind of like, okay, now you got to find out if you're a good fighter. Okay, you made it past 15-0. 20-0 is like when you're fighting that next tier world title level opponent. That's when 20-0 is typically when most fighters fight for a world title. Might be a little off, but 20-0 is typically the magic number. When I learned there's a difference was Andy Vences beats Casey Ramos, but it completely didn't matter to the boxing world at all. There was no impact.
Mm.
There was no movement. No one cared. And Casey Ramos was a very tough opponent, undefeated fighter, signed with Top Rank, ran for government office. And I realized, oh, the very next night, Manny Pacquiao, Jesse Vargas. Not as competitive fight. Not the odds said it wasn't as competitive. And that fight had the debut of Teofimo Lopez, and that fight had Zhu Shiming, and all these headlines came from it. And when I realized was it's not just about who you fight and getting those records, it's about the entertainment portion of this business. And you have to be able to entertain while fighting those fighters who give you that legacy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned one thing that really stood out to me when we first started talking. This is the first book. You potentially mentioned already that there's a second book you have coming, coming hopefully in the future. Now, my mind is thinking the next people in boxing that really need your voice would be media, because I feel like media still needs a guide on how to navigate because, traditional journalism is kind of like a lost thing in boxing. Is that where you're going, or did you have another guide in mind for your next potential boxing book?
I mean, that would be kind of interesting to do a book with boxing media, like get quotes from you, Gail, Abe, like a lot of people I respect, and be like, what's wrong with boxing media? Or like, what should boxing media do? And just have like a deep discussion, because like I could see doing something like that where it's like the fog of war, which is one of my favorite movies, where it's like
Right.
life lessons. Like in this book, like I don't know if it's just the way I think, but I didn't want to preach to people. I wanted to leave questions for people to think about. Here's my thoughts, but at the end, don't formulate your opinions based on my thoughts. Sit and stew and create your own opinions after this. I don't want to ever have people recite what I say, just interpret what I say. But if I were to write another book, the goal would be to kind of get some gym stories. I think that I have so many relationships with so many fighters that this book I really didn't share the gym stories because I didn't feel comfortable kind of sharing the real good stories, all that stuff. But obviously a couple of fighters I know I could do career retrospects with them, but I think the big thing is there's a lot of good gym stories that I've been in front of, and then maybe even talking to really good fighters if they'd let me, and kind of going through a good story with them. So making them tell me the story 3 times over, and we kind of walk through what made that story interesting. I think that that would be interesting to get like the 50 greatest gym stories, or the 50 best fighters, the hardest fighter they faced, and what made that fighter hard. Something of that capacity, because I just feel like boxing in print form, it's a lot of stuff written in a manner to be like, I'm smart. you should value my opinion. And it's not really written for the boxers or the coaches all that much. You have to learn the language of what's being written. So I wanted to write something that like a parent could buy my book, and I hope that it could help their kid. And I really tried to write it in a way where like you could have any education level and it's accessible.
Got it. Now, one thing you did touch head on that a lot of people don't like to talk about is what happens when you lose. We know how fighters are. They never fathom losing. They imagine if I'm at my best, no one can beat me. And we've seen over and over how devastating that is when they suffer that first loss, when they've done everything right and it still doesn't happen in the ring. And I think what you talked about really well is that it's not just about the fighter. The whole team feels it, because everybody's invested. Everybody, the publicist, the cut man, they all feel the weight of that loss. Talk a little bit about, I know I don't want to give away who you mentioned in the book, but how just the
I'll
heaviness.
give it away. Let's give
Okay.
it away. Let's
Let's
give it
go.
away. Like, I mean, because look, if someone's tuning into this podcast, they're either going to buy the book or they're at least going to have a good conversation. Let's give it away. Like, it's not like this
Got
is
it.
top secret. We got to give it away.
Perfect. So Guy Robb, you talked about that loss that he had to Mariaga. Just run through how rough that was for you to see, knowing how hard he prepared to get knocked out like that.
Well, I mean, I think that just the backstory for that one, and I don't remember how I wrote it because for writing it for history's sake, I have to be a little bit more political than I can on your show. So I
Mhm.
remember Guy telling me that Herb Stone, who was his manager at the time, him and his coach Ray, they didn't see eye to eye on the fight. Ray didn't love the fight. Herb just proposed the fight. Guy took the fight. There was friction between Ray and Herb to start over the fight. Mariaga had just fought Nicholas Walters. It was a big HBO fight. Guy was excited to fight a marquee guy like that. I want to say Guy Robb, it felt like in two more fights from the record he had, he would have been a world champion. He had envisioned it and seen it. So it was one of these things. Dak Prescott was the rookie Dallas quarterback for the Cowboys. I remember that was a preseason game. And then they had one of these lobby bars where if you gambled a nickel, you could drink all night. So I remember like they gave me like at least like 10 Coronas the night before because I just was putting a nickel in and they kept giving me Coronas. And I remember he gets knocked out. And what was that guy's name? He always fights. He's a 108 pounder. He's for Puerto Rico. We called him Barriqua at the event, and he showed up right behind me. Um, I'll pull up his name. He's gonna fight Oscar Vasquez. He got stopped in one round by Angel Acosta recently on a Golden Boy card. Um, I'm blanking on his name. I'm getting older, but so he pulls up behind me and he goes, "I told you he was pretty good." And it was like it wasn't just like my buddy got knocked out. So this fighter goes, "I told you he's pretty good," and it was like, man. And I went through so many different stages of grief and growing because I remember I was so mad at Mariaga, and then I saw him and he was just this innocent nice person, and he came up and shook my hand, and he was so respectful, and it was like, man, I can't hate this guy. And then we went to I wanted to drive home. It was 4 hours from my house. I was like, man, can we drive home? My buddy had been drinking. He drove. So we had to stay at the Motel 6 that night. And we go to this bowling alley, and I think we intimidated the owner. So the owners, you never want to go to a dive bar and they're telling you about money. You never want the
Right.
owner of the dive bar telling you, "Oh man, I make this much." Like you're like, "Oh God, we're in this." So then my buddy, I thought was gonna knock out the bartender because he thought that he called him a racial slur with a Mexican thing. But I
Mhm.
guess he didn't. But it got really tense because I'd never seen my buddy stand up. He's a 6'1" big guy, used to play football. Thought he was gonna deck this guy. So then we got a free pitcher. This is gonna sound like I'm alcoholic because there's so much alcohol in this. So we got a free pitcher and a free round of bowling in Fallon, Nevada. I just saw my friend get knocked out. I don't know where my friend is. Super awkward. It was one of those where you leave the parking lot and you're just talking amongst yourself and confused. Go to a bowling alley, a fight almost ensues. And like I didn't even want to drink because it's like I'm so frustrated. And it's like those are the type of lessons that mold you into, okay, if that happens again, how can I be big bro for someone? How can I not have someone be at the bowling alley at 11:35 when their friend gets knocked out on a solo box AO card? What can you do to prep someone? So that did I answer the question on that one?
Oh, definitely. Like you said, the stages of grief and all the emotions that you go through, you encapsulated that.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think the better example is with Gabriel Flores, right? I've known him since he
Mhm.
was a high schooler, right?
Right.
So I don't view him as a fighter. I view him almost like my little brother. So it's like no one would imagine that he would lose two out of his last three fights. No one envisioned this. And then I once got mad at a media guy and called him because the guy was being real disrespectful. And then I had to realize, oh, you just care. So then it's like, okay, I had to apologize to the guy, but it's like it's so complicated when you like unconditionally love someone and they're on a public platform and you don't know if they're going to be okay because of the damage they're taking in a fight. And the fans have no connection. So they're allowed to have opinions. But then it's like you want to see what they're saying, but then you don't want to see because you don't know how you'll react. And I don't know if I did a good job explaining that in the book, but I wanted people to be aware that it's very like this is not all fun and games. All these fighters we're going to see on Friday or prospects, most of them are going to lose one day. And when they lose, people are going to say everything they did up until that point was not great. And you have to stay rational in this game because people are built up to fail.
Right. Exactly. And as the fans give their opinions, media people give their opinions, and they go on to the next. And then that fighter has to have the resolve in themselves to continue on if they decide to, or if they want to pivot and do something else. That's what people forget about, that human element of who has to pick up the pieces after a devastating loss like that. And I felt that you explained that well, particularly in Guy Rob's case, where he pivoted. He didn't fight again, but he became a homeowner, had a family, and that's still a success story. You got out of boxing with all of your faculties and was able to invest in another area of your life. That goes back to what you've been talking about as far as defining what success is for you as a boxer or after
Right.
your boxing life.
I mean, compare that to like Tino Avila, who I talk about in the book. The first sparring session he has, he gets cut. So he never spars and he's fighting Jojo Diaz. I go out with him. He hasn't sparred. I mean, I thought he could win, but my expectation was dramatically lower compared to Guy Robb, where I'm thinking, okay, if Guy Robb wins this fight, he's probably fighting Oscar Valdez. And it's probably on that Manny Pacquiao, Jesse Vargas card. And it would have been Andy fights the night before, Guy Robb's on the pay-per-view card. And we had a 50-50 fight and we're winning the fight and we get knocked out. And it's like, oof, like that's a haunting. And I think Guy Robb is one of my heroes because how many people would that define him and they'd become an alcoholic? Guy just said,
Exactly.
okay, you know what? I've had a cool career. I don't want to become a gatekeeper. I'm going to become a professional in another industry and I'm going to buy a house and take care of my family. And he had the courage to say, I had a great career. And I think Guy Robb I think the problem is boxing so unhealthy. A fighter like Emilio Sanchez has had a great boxing career, yet the fans will say he didn't have a career. Yet he was on Team USA. He challenged for world title type fights on TV. The fans have an unhealthy standard of what's a success in boxing. And I think that kind of, and it's not the fans' fault. It's all they know, right? It's all they know because that's what we're told. Undefeated records. That's what's good, good, good. But we do have to work to change it to say that fighters like Gabe Rosado actually matter and they're not bums. Like they're having good careers.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Well, I definitely appreciate your time. Anything you want to leave us with as far as the book goes that we did not cover?
I just want to ask you, is it a good book? Like, is it actually good or like just an honest opinion? Like, is it written okay? Is it compelling? Like, is it just decent to read?
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I read the whole thing in one day. I like the fact that you laid out everything that a boxer has to go through on their path. And I made sure I kind of read it if I had no knowledge of boxing. I just loved it. I love what I saw and I want to learn more about it. And somebody gave me this book. Would this empower me to get my foot in the door and get started? And it absolutely did. So you nailed everything you set out to accomplish to do. Very easy to read. I didn't feel like anybody would get caught up anywhere and not know what you were talking about. So it's very thorough, but very good introduction. So a layman can pick it up and get everything out of it that they need to get.
Well, I just want to say thank you for reading the book and supporting because I mean, look, I'm not trying to get rich off of this book. I'm just trying to leave something in a legacy. God gave me a life to be a person and to have this, and I'm trying to leave this world better than I came into it. And part of the legacy tour for me is to leave behind what I feel like I've learned in boxing. Hopefully, I can continue to do that. And I also want to mention I'm working on doing an audio version because I do know some people can't read, and there is a gap in the ability of people to negotiate power if they can't read. So this is going to be accessible on iTunes and Audibles for people if they struggle with reading comprehension. We're looking to bridge that gap for people.
That is fantastic. And to let everybody know, we'll definitely be doing the giveaway on beatsboxingmayhem.com for everyone to get hopefully a signed copy of the book sent
We're
out.
gonna get you a signed one. I'm gonna get you the signed one. We're gonna get you the signed one, and I'm gonna have one for the host. Even though you have your copy, maybe that copy you read, you can give that to somebody else. But you're getting a signed one directly from me, and one of your listeners is getting one as well.
Awesome. Appreciate your time, Lukey, and everyone go out and get the book Inside the Ropes of Boxing. Lucas Ketelle, available on paperback, on Amazon, and on Kindle as well.
Just thank you for everything, man.
Appreciate you and congratulations on the monumental achievement.